Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Haze Long and today I will show you how I paint this black portrait. So a while back I launched my Portrait 2022 brush pack, which is brand new, and I launched it like a week or two ago, and someone made a request for this black portrait and I was quite amused and surprised at the same time because I launched a brush pack which is actually a tool set for you to paint any kind of portrait that you want. It is not a color palette, which means you can literally paint with any color that you have. But today I have chosen this very complex black portrait which I myself couldn't figure out the color of the skin. So I'm gonna show you how I tackle this problem using the grayscale to color painting method. So first we will sketch the portrait and then paint the grayscale under it, and then after that I will show you how I modify one of my brushes to become two brand new brushes, and we will paint all over the portrait again for details. Then lastly I will show you how I add a glow to all the bees. So right now let's jump into the first step, which is sketching and painting the grayscale. But please be reminded that black portraits are very dark in value, and most of the values are very close to each other, so you might need to put your iPad to a maximum brightness before you can see the differences between the values. So usually when I shoot my videos, I will shoot at a 40% brightness for my iPad, but today I crank it up right to 100% brightness, so you might see some loss in details in the highlights of the text in the interface of my Procreate. So this is the sketch that I have now. If you notice, it's a little bit different from the sketches of my other portraits, and it's because all the lines are geometrically straight. So when we are doing a male portrait, we usually use a lot more harder edge lines and also straighter lines instead of using softer curves when we are doing female portraits. So this is something that you should look out for when you're doing male portraits. To add a touch of masculinity, you should always use straight lines instead of curvy lines. So first we're going to prepare our reference photo for our grayscale painting. We're going to use the hue, saturation and brightness tool. We're going to reduce the saturation all the way to 0 so that it becomes black and white. The photo has a lot of texture, so it's difficult to see the values, so we're going to use the Gaussian blur tool and increase it a little bit to blur out all the texture away so that we can identify the values easier. Once I'm done, I can then save this as an image and load this into my reference to refer when I am painting my grayscale. So now I've loaded the image into my reference window already, and I can then go ahead and delete the extra layer that I've created for the black and white, and I'm gonna use a new layer. But now let's just invert the sketch layer first, because if the sketch layer is dark color, we won't be able to see it when we are painting. So the first brush that I will be using is the sketch brush for my new Portrait Brush Pack 2022, and I'm going to load the grayscale color palette that I have. You can also download this from my website, and I'm going to load this so that I can pick the values easier. I'm going to pick the 6th value and I'm going to draw an outline for the entire portrait. The reason why I picked the number 6 value is because that's the mid-tone for this portrait, which means that it's right smack in the middle and it's not the highlight nor the shadows. So I'm using this value to first block in the outlines for the entire portrait. Then once the outline is done, I will drop the same value into the rest of the areas, and I'll clean up the edges where they meet, because sometimes they don't really fill the color in properly. Once I've cleaned up already and everything is good to go, I will then swipe down with 3 fingers and lock the alpha for this layer. So I'm going to reduce the opacity for the sketch layer so that I can see better when I'm painting, and then I can create a new layer and make that layer into a clipping mask. This layer has to be directly above the grey painting that we did earlier on. And now the first step, we will be using the airbrush from the Portrait Brush Pack to do the next darker shade, which is shade number 7. So we work from big to small, so we start with a big brush size to place in all the big values first, and this is just going one step darker at a time. So I'm going over all the areas that I feel need this new value. So for this step, I'm not worried about the shape of the values yet. I am just worried about the location of the value, so I'm just painting the value down into the correct location. When we are working on complex painting or paintings that we have not done before, it's really important for us to simplify the process as much as possible for ourselves. So the way to simplify the process is to address one problem at a time. Step 2 is to use the smudge tool. Make sure that flat brush smudge is loaded into the smudge tool, and then we will use this to push the value into the correct shape. Because this value is separated into this new layer, we won't be disturbing the other values below it, so we are just moving them into different shapes and sizes to match the one that we see in the photo reference. And also, one very important thing to remember is that you need to adjust the size of your smudge tool each time you move to a new area to match back the size of the smudge size that you want to create. At any time, we can switch back to the sketch tool to add in more shapes with the sketch brush or the airbrush, and then we can go back to the smudge tool to smudge them out into the shapes that we want. Alternatively, we can also use the eraser tool to erase away shapes, and then we can smudge it out after that. So in step 1, we were using the airbrush to figure out the location of the values, and now we're using the smudge tool, the eraser tool, and the sketch tool to figure out the shapes of the value. When we are done, we can proceed to step 3, which is using the sketch tool and the eraser tool to restate or erase the values. So now I'm using the sketch brush to restate some of the darkest area with the same value first, so that they have a good foundation for the next few layers after this. So this way our value shapes will be very clean, and it will be very chunky and stately, and it's very suitable for male portraits also. Once you're ready, we'll go to the eraser tool and erase away some of the values that we don't want anymore from this layer. So this is the last thing that you need to do for this step 3, which is to erase away the values in areas that you don't want them to be, and make sure to reduce or increase your brush size as you work. You can always switch to the smudge tool to smudge away the shapes and to get the shape that you want even after you erase. Make sure to erase in all the areas that has highlights that is supposed to be lighter, so make sure that those areas are light enough and just erase them first. This would be the last thing to do for this layer, so make sure you get all the steps down first. Now let's review what we have so far. We have the first layer, which is done using value number 6. So let's rename that 6, and we have a new layer just now, which we have done in value 7. So let's rename that 7 as well. And now we'll create a new layer and rename that 8. And you guessed it, we are going to use the value number 8 to paint on this layer. Make sure that clipping mask is on, and we will repeat all the steps that we have done before. Do you still remember them? The first step is to use the airbrush and paint the new value 8 in the correct location in large patches. Then we use the smudge tool to reshape these patches into the shapes that we want. We can also use the sketch and eraser tool to put in even more shapes and to make the shapes more distinct. And in step 3, we would restate the dark areas again with the sketch brush and also use the eraser tool to pull out even more highlights. So I'll repeat this entire process for another layer called number 9 using the value 9, and we won't use any black color for this painting at all. So we'll just use number 9 for our black color instead. Using the airbrush, I'm just only going to paint the top of the head, and I'm not going to use the airbrush anymore. Instead, we are going to change our brush to the natural sketch brush or the sketch brush to immediately restate all the darkest area in this portrait. Then after that, I'm actually going to turn off the sketch layer and try and adjust and edit and modify all the painting layers that I have in order to make them be supported even without the sketch layer. So all the edges and the outlines, I'm going to try and clean them up and smudge them up and make sure that the outlines are clean and they can survive without the sketch layer. Now our shadows are done, so the next step would be to create a new layer, make that a clipping mask and call it number 5, because we'll be using the value 5, which is one shade lighter than our base color. So make sure that this layer is right on top of all the other shadow layers, because you would want your highlights to be on top of your shadows so that they stand out and pop more. And here I'm just straight using the sketch brush to sketch in the highlights and then using the smudge tool to smudge them out to get the shape that I want. There are certain areas that when you paint the highlights, you don't really need to smudge them out, so this would give a more edgier portrait, especially if you're painting a male portrait. Your highlights have to be a lot stiffer than if you paint a female portrait. I felt that like I've jumped a value, so I'm going to create another layer below number 5 and call it number 6. So I'm going to repaint the base value to some of the areas that require them, especially some areas that don't really require value 5, and I'm going to use number 6 instead to use that as the highlight. But I'll quickly jump back to the number 5 layer and put in even more highlights using the value 5, because the layer with value 6 is not really required, especially if you have been using your eraser in every layer and erasing away for the highlights. I'll create a last layer which is value number 4 for the final highlights. So you can create as many layers as you want, but usually we would want to constrain the number of values in our portrait. However, the portrait that I've chosen this time is unexpectedly challenging, and it's very high in contrast, which means that it has a lot of values. So I think I require this many amount of values in my portrait this time. Once you are done with your final highlights, zoom out and make it the size of your reference and make them really small and put them side by side and check the values like that, and then see if you need to change anything. So if you need to change anything, you can just adjust the layers. Also, at this point in time, you need to turn off your sketch layer already. Your layer should be sufficient enough to give you all the detail that you need, and you don't need the sketch layer anymore. So make sure that you clean up all your strokes and your brush marks, your value shapes. Everything needs to be cleaned up before we proceed to the coloring stage. Next, we would use the change color only brush to try and figure out what colors is in our portrait. So now let's change the workspace for coloring. We'll remove the grayscale palette and we will change the reference to the colored one. And then for all the layers, we're going to turn on alpha lock, including the base layer number 6 at the bottom. So the reason why I've separated all the values into different layers is so that we can color them separately, because I've never done this kind of portrait before and I have no idea what color to use. So we're gonna turn off everything except for the base layer and just apply some color theory when it comes to coloring this portrait and see how it goes. So we will use the change color only brush, and then for the base color I'm just gonna pick a blue and test various shades of blue and see which one works. And once I found that one that works and matches the one that I see in the photo reference, I'm just gonna use it for the base layer itself. I'm not gonna try and deny the color of the skin itself. I know it's not blue, but I'm just going to paint what I see here and not vary so much. I actually use a very light touch, so it still has a lot of grays in this layer, by the way. And now I'm going to use the hue, saturation and brightness tool in this layer to adjust the color a little bit and try and get the exact blue that I want. Okay, now I'm going to turn on the next layer, number 7, and I'm going to paint this layer with the color that I think it is. So if the base layer is blue, it's gonna head towards red, so which means we're gonna have to go towards purple first. So we're gonna shift the colors towards that direction little bit by little bit with each layer, if that makes sense. I don't know if it's correct, but I do know that all skin always head towards red in the end or in the middle. So I'm just going to test this theory out and quickly map the painting this way with the correct colors. Oddly, if you notice, now that I've changed the colors to gradually shift the temperature, you can see that there are some strokes here that started showing up that wasn't visible before, and the colors before appear slightly lighter or darker depending on the color that was assigned to it. So I'm gonna smudge it out to get the shapes right again. So this happened because every color has their own inherent value, meaning some colors they visually appear darker than other colors. So this will affect your coloring when you're doing a grayscale to color method. So you can always check and see if you need to brighten or darken that layer itself. So now I'm heading to value 9 and I'm going to push the color a bit to the red area again, and I'm going to color the entire layer. And I can notice that like nothing much is pretty happening here, but I'm just going to proceed anyway to test my theory out first instead of worrying so much. So now in value 6,
here comes the problem. Because we are heading towards the highlight, we have to identify the colors of the highlight as well. So I'm just going to fake it till I make it and go towards the hotter colors. So I'm just testing out the color temperature for the highlights layer and see if I can go warmer for these layers, and hopefully I can figure out the color of the highlights without resorting to picking the color from the photo. Okay, now that we have some colors in all our layers, we're going to go back to the first layer, layer number 6. And if you see here in my color picker, all the history of the colors that we've been using is here so far. And because I was the one who picked the colors, I know which is blue and which is red, even though they all look gray. So I'm going to pick the correct one and try and recolor this base in certain areas, because I know certain areas the base need to be a bit more pink, more purple. And then now when I turn on layer 7, I got a shock because look at how streaky the strokes are. They are not blended at all. It's because the color temperature changed already for the base, and then now the layer 7 appears a lot darker than it should be. So right now I'm just going to use the smudge tool and smudge away all these unsightly streaks first and get a proper layer going on before I proceed to coloring this layer. And so after that, I turn on the alpha lock and recolor this layer itself. I'm dropping in blues for some of the shadow areas, and I can't help but wonder if this layer is too light or is it too dark, because something seems to be missing here, like the values doesn't gel together anymore once the color is in. So I know this is an issue that I need to fix later on, but for now I just want to color the layer first and adjust the brightness or darkness of the layers later on. And now I'm dropping in the pinks and the reds for some of the hotter areas of the face. But I was really disturbed by the value change once the color temperature is in. So now I'm going to turn on all the layers and see what's happening. And I realized that the layer number 7 is not showing up at all, and it's not enough value shapes in there. So now I am going to add more shapes in there. So back to the grayscale palette, I'm going to pick value number 7, and using the airbrush again, I'm going to add in a couple more shapes. Then I'm going to alpha lock this layer again and use the change color only brush to change the color of the new patch that I've added in. So it's going to be in blues and reds, and now I'm also starting to use the reds and the pinks around the edges of the value shapes here to suggest some form of a terminator as they head towards the highlight. So I've recolored already with all the existing colors that we already have, and right now I can modify the pink one to be a bit more saturated by pushing it towards the vibrant area. So once I do this, when I paint, you can immediately see that the color is a lot stronger than it is. And I can change the temperature again by shifting it towards orange to paint the terminator for the nose, which is the most saturated part of this painting, I feel. And now we'll go to layer 8. So example, if your layer is made of purple, you would want to further detail with blue and red, which is the colder side and also the redder side of whatever color is on the current layer. So this layer is like a very gray purple, right? So now I'm detailing with more blue, adding more blues to the shadows, and then after that I'm gonna add in more reds as well. So I'm finding it hard to proceed this way because the value has changed so much. It's not dark enough. So right now I'm going to adjust every layer and make them darker and see if I can get back the values to be correct. So I'm adjusting the curves and the hue, saturation, brightness for each layer and see if I can get back the values that I had before I color them. So the value seems to be correct right now, and I'm on layer 6 trying to recolor some of the gray patches that you see here for the highlights and making them gel with the painting itself. So the highlights are going to be from pink to orange. So now I'm starting with pink first, and I'm going to turn on the layer 5 and I'm going to apply like the more orangey version of the pink for the highlights. I'm also dropping in an icy blue for the eyes. Okay, so now I'm going to actually go back to every single layer and check everything and adjust all the colors individually for every single layer before I proceed. Once everything is okay and looks almost like the photo, I'm going to try and apply some creative decisions and make certain areas more vibrant and more saturated. Like what I'm doing right now, I'm actually adding a lot more reds to the portrait compared to the photo itself. And I can even take it a step further and go to each single layer and increase the saturation for the layers. This will add a lot more vibrancy, but basically I was just experimenting and seeing how far I can push the colors before the whole painting becomes unrecognizable.
Now we're gonna make a new layer and paint all over again. I will also show you how I modify the flat brush smudge brush into two brand new painting brush.
So we're going to start by creating two brushes. By duplicating the flat brush smudge, we're going to modify this brush into our new brushes. So let's pick one of them and call one of it Painting Temp for now. And then we're going to head into the grain section and pick this zigzag texture for our grain. And then we can adjust the scale of the grain so that it has some artifacts around the edges of the stroke like this. And then we're going to increase the spacing a little bit to get even more artifacts. And we can head into the Apple Pencil section and increase the bleed for the brush so that it bleeds a bit more at the beginning and the end. Now let's create the second brush. So select the second duplicate of the flat brush smudge and we will call this Grainy Painting. Then we will go into Apple Pencil section and increase the bleed for this brush as well so that we get a bleed at the beginning and the end. And next we will go to the shape section and pick a new shape for our brush. I'm gonna pick this Ink Mask brush, and if you see here there's some artifacts repeating at the edges, so we want to fix that. Let's go to Stroke Path and reduce the spacing until the artifacts disappear. Then we're gonna head into grain and import a new source from the library. We're gonna pick brick for our grain, and then here we are going to increase the movement all the way to the right so that the texture appears stamped instead of smudged. And then for the scale, we are going to increase or reduce it until we get a texture size that is appropriate for our portrait painting this time. Then we will also increase zoom all the way to the right, and because this effect is not very apparent, we are going to increase the contrast of the grain all the way. And now I'm just going to the taper section and taper off the opacity and the pressure for the end of the stroke. The wet mix and the rendering tab determines whether the brush will be a normal brush or a painterly brush. So we're going to make a painterly brush. So let's go to the rendering tab and make it into an intense blending brush. This is like oil painting. Then we will go into wet mix. The moment we increase the dilution, it means that the painterly effect will be turned on already. So I'm just going to increase it to 60% plus. And for charge, it means that how much paint is loaded into the brush at the beginning. And for attack, how much paint is loaded when we press harder. So we're going to reduce that, and pull is basically the blending effect when we paint over it within the single stroke. So we are going to have that painterly effect once we set the setting itself. You can test this brush, and if you need it to appear even more opaque, you can reduce the dilution in the wet mix section like this. So this works now. I can use this brush to lay down texture, and it can still have a painterly effect if I use it because it can smudge a little bit. So we're going to use these two brushes to paint. So now we're going to start with painting the ear first. Our colors is here already, is correct. We have a new layer above all the other layers, and we're going to use the Painting Temp brush to paint this time. And all we are going to do is pick the colors from the existing layers below, and we're going to repaint the entire face with the correct brush stroke, with the correct intensity and the confidence and the style that we want to paint. So what is happening here, I'm actually just using this brush to paint in solid strokes. There's no erasing. I'm painting them in the shapes that they are, and then after that I'm going to overlap over them again with the highlights. So this method of painting requires you to paint from dark to light because you're going to stack the lighter colors and the vibrant colors on top of the shadows and the darker colors. You can use the grainy painting brush for the highlights when you're ready to stack them on top of your shadows. So just pick colors from other parts of your face if you can find them. Just find the colors that you need and pick them and paint them for the highlights. The other features are also painted in this same method but with a slight variation. So for the nose, I'm still using the Painting Temp brush to lay down all the brush stroke first. Then after that, I'll switch to the grainy painting brush to lay down the highlight section. So the highlight section for any black portrait has a lot of textures. So this texture is going to be simulated with the grainy painting brush, which is just created for this purpose. Then I'll switch back to the painting pen brush to lay in even more thicker highlights on top of the existing texture, and then after that I will actually use the sketch brush to put in some dots for the texture itself, and then I'll use the smudge tool to smudge out the dots so that they appear more faded and more natural. For the eyes, I use the same technique, but instead of using the painting pen brush, I'm using the natural sketch brush because this brush is a lot easier to use for tight and small areas like this. The painting pen brush is a bit too large and abstract for tight strokes that needs to be neat. With each different area, I'm applying different techniques for the texture, for the highlights. So for this, I'm putting in a grainy painting base first for the texture highlight, and then after that, when I zoom in, I can see that there are some crevices within the grain of the brush itself. So I'm taking advantage of that and using the natural sketch brush to sketch within the shapes that I can see from the natural texture of the brush stroke. So this kind of gives it like a scale texture almost, and I can work around this texture to give it like a skin texture look. And then for the brows, I'm also using the natural sketch brush to sketch in the hairs one by one for the ends of his brows, which is a lot thinner than the inner side of his brow. For the other side of the brow, I'm using the natural sketch brush to sketch in mainly highlights for the brow itself, because this side of the brow is a lot darker, but it has a lot of modeling in terms of highlights in the hair itself. The same method and technique applies to painting the lips. I did the texture and the highlights the same way, but the lips has a lot of natural wrinkles that flows naturally from the center of the lips outwards. So for these lines, you can either use the brush or the smudge tool to smudge them out in the direction that you want first. So do a couple of these lines, and after that you can clean it up by adding highlights or shadows to them. The lips here are quite large, and despite the size, the details are insane. So instead of using all the paint pen brush or the grainy painting brush, I'm mostly doing the entire lips using the natural sketch brush, and I feel like I've been sketching all the way through the entire lip and putting in all the details all the time. The hair is the easiest to paint. I use the watercolor brush pack dabbing brush, and I use that to add more fuzz all over the border of the hair. So I do the entire hair itself, and I also did the insides as well. So basically, I'm just setting up the texture of the hair so that it can receive more detail later on. So I have to work from big to small, which is why I started out with this dabbing brush first instead of straight going in there with the hair waves brush. Now I use the crosshatch brush for my new portrait brush pack, and I added some waves here and there randomly all over the hair. This will be like the bigger curls compared to the tighter curls that we'll be doing later on. And now finally, I changed to the hair waves brush to put all the tight little curls all over his head. This time I start from dark to light, and for the lighter color, I'm actually using it for the highlights of the hair. And then for the finishing touch, I'm switching to the freckles textured brush to put in highlight dots for the entire head. The skin itself is the most challenging thing for this portrait, which is why I left it till the end, because I needed very bold big strokes to show how confident the strokes are. I used the painting pen brush to do it, and even though it may look effortless now, but actually I've edited away like millions and millions of undos here. So this is what you see now. Is kind of perfect, but I assure you it is not. So sometimes I would paint, and then after that I would erase away the additional brush stroke that I don't want you guys to see. So this has gotten so complex that I've used one brush stroke per layer, and then after that I will merge the layers to clean up and keep things organized. For the texture, I started the same way. I used the grainy painting brush to lay in the base texture first. So I keep on laying these textured highlights until they reach an intensity that they have the same value of the highlights value in the photo reference. So it needs to be as bright as that before I proceed with using the skin highlight brush to add in the skin texture all over the forehead first for even more texture. Then after that, to simulate the dotted texture, I am switching to the freckles textured brush to lay in a base first. This is all on separate layers, okay? So once I've laid this down, I am erasing the extras that I don't want first. Then I'll individually go to each dot that I want to highlight. I would use the natural sketch brush and add shadows for each of the freckles. These are for the freckles that I want to accentuate, and for those that I just want them to sort of fade away, I leave them alone. Then I would use the Painting 10 brush again to add in the last few confidence strokes for the highlights. And then after this, I would repeat the exact same steps for every single part of the face. So if you see here, all my actions may seem random, but actually they are all the same steps that I've broken down for you earlier just now. So if you look here carefully, you can see which steps I'm currently on. And the most important thing to note in the tutorial is not to follow my steps exactly, but is to take advantage of the tools that you have, which are your brushes, your color palettes, and your reference, and use that to create your own steps and your own procedure when you're painting something difficult like this. First, you need to know what kind of texture you're looking for and what kind of brush strokes you're looking for and how to achieve it. So once you experiment and nail down like the steps to achieve the texture and the look that you want, you can then repeat that for every single part of your painting. Then that would be a lot quicker rather than experimenting on every single part every single time.
Lastly, I'll show you how to paint the glow around the bees.
So these are the bees that I have, and we need to adjust the color of the portrait first to match the bees intensity. So I'm going to flatten a copy of the portrait, and I'm going to use the color balance tool here to adjust the color a little bit for the portrait so that it's more warm and closer to the color of the bees. So let me explain a little bit about glow first. So this one goes from red to orange and to yellow. So the color temperature actually changes every time you go brighter. So this goes from blue to green to white. It doesn't go from blue to light blue to white. So it always changes the color temperature. Like this one goes from purple to pink to white. So that makes more sense. So first, we're going to go back to the layer that we have flattened just now, and we're going to paint on this layer first. We're going to use the change color only brush, and using orange, we're just going to change the color of the section of the face to orange first. Then we can create a new layer and make sure this layer has the add blending mode, and we can continue laying down orange first, and then after that we can lay in some yellows to the highlight of the glow itself. Don't forget to bounce some colors onto the shadow and also the highlights of the face if your glow managed to reach them. And also you can have some creative adventure and add some colors to your other parts of the painting like the eyes and also the environment itself. I'm also taking the liberty to adding some more glows and dots all over the face.
Okay guys, thank you so much for watching. This has been a complex painting for me, and I hope you guys enjoyed today's massive tutorial. So I'll see you soon in my next video. Let me know in the comments below what kind of content that you would like to watch, and remember to comment, subscribe and like. I'll see you next time. Bye!